So happy that you're all joining us today from all across the US. We are going to get started. We're going to give you a brief intro about what this work has looked like, what the purpose of our call today, who we are today on this call. My name is Rani Banjarian, and I'm a consultant here at Education Elements. My instructional background is in math instruction. I've taught everything under the sun when it pertains to math, fifth grade math, all the way through ACT prep, AP calculus, AP statistics. I'm based out of Nashville, Tennessee. I will be hosting today's webinar, and I am joined by my colleague, Shelby, who is our in-house expert on data culture, and I will hand off the mic to Shelby for her to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I am really excited about this conversation. I've been in the world of data culture for a long time, only newly starting to learn more about personalized learning thanks to joining Education Elements about 2 years ago. So it's been really interesting to see how these worlds come together and looking forward to the conversation. I'm based in Austin, Texas, so it's lovely to see some Texans on the webinar today. But yeah, I'm really excited. I've loved working with Rani on this content too. So I think we've got a good conversation in store for you. And really, we'll say this a number of times, but I'm looking forward to your contributions and questions as well. So please join in on the conversation as we go. Thanks, Rani.
Thank you so much, Shelby. This may be the first one you're joining, or you've been able to join all of the other expert conversations that we've had a chance to hold over the past couple of weeks. As you know, as part of our launch of personalized learning reimagined, we wanted everybody on the internet and all of you all to have an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into all of the principles that we've articulated now around personalizing learning. And so out of the four that are on your screen right now, and we'll dive into what each of those represents in a moment: student-centered design, nurturing learning, equity focus, and data informed. Today, the topic of our conversation is data informed. All of the previous ones have been recorded. They're all on our YouTube channel. So feel free, if you didn't know that they were happening, or if you weren't able to join, feel free to check those recordings out on YouTube as well. So like I said, we have been able, as part of our reimagining of personalizing learning, we've been able to articulate 4 systems level design principles that inform systems level change, making sure that personalizing learning in our design process, that it is explicitly student-centered, that it explicitly tackles this idea of social awareness, social emotional learning, that it nurtures learning environments, that it is explicitly equity focused, and finally, that it explicitly targets the importance of having a data-informed culture at your school or at your district. And so when we think about data-informed and being data-informed, we think about how your organization can have deeply embedded practices and norms about how data is used. Thinking about a holistic approach to data that is sustainable and that is user-centered. And that is what we're going to dive into our conversation today. What we're going to do today is we're going to have a conversation, an expert conversation with Shelby, but also give you all an opportunity to share a variety of perspectives in the chat. In a moment, we're gonna give you a sense of how you can contribute in the chat, promote conversation, and most importantly, discuss how building a strong data culture is explicitly aligned to personalizing learning and your journey towards personalizing learning in your context. This is a slide that we've used before with a lot of success. Sometimes we'll say, hey, engage in the chat, put your questions in the chat. But what we'd like for you today is think about a couple of new ways to engage in the chat. Maybe you've seen the slide before. So as Shelby and I are having our conversation, if there's a new insight or idea that's sparked in your head, please share it in the chat, but tag it with #AHA. Another option is #debate. If you feel like you have a different opinion that you'd like to share or would like to push back on what was shared by someone else. Hashtag question if you need a clarification on something that has been shared. And hashtag on fire if this really resonates with you, or if this is something that you are already doing in your district and you just want to kind of like toot your own horn, pat yourself on the back, boost your ego. Totally feel free to do that in the chat. Say, this is already something that we do, hashtag on fire.
Hey, Ronnie, can I add, if those of you who are not watching this live and you're watching the recording, we also would love to have these kinds of hashtags and comments in the video comments below. So just wanted to add that for our recorded audience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I wanted to very briefly frame, in the previous slide, we talked about the principles that inform our systems level change. So our systems and structures on our adult teams, in our adult practices, those are the things that we wanted to call out explicitly, and being data informed is one of them. So we have that framework, but coupled with that framework, in tandem with that framework, is our approach to instructional strategy. So this is how this lives out in the classroom. And you may be familiar with the core 4 elements of personalizing learning that is plastered all over our website and all over our materials. But it might be helpful to think about these 2 frameworks in this way. Data informed being one of the design principles that impact systems level change, whereas the core 4 are a set of instructional strategies that live out in the classroom. And when you think about the core 4, you're thinking about reflection and goal setting, flexible path and pace, targeted instruction, and collaboration and creativity, all kind of cradled by this idea of nurturing learning environments with student ownership at the center. It is the holy grail. It's the center of this disc of the core 4 elements. Nurturing learning environments are essential. And these are the 4 components of classroom practices. So that's what's happening in the classroom. The goal is student ownership. But again, zooming out and thinking about this at a systems level, how can we ensure that we have these deeply embedded practices and norms about how we use our data, how it's being holistic, user-centered, and sustainable? So I'm going to dive into our first question. I'm going to ask a question, ask Shelby to respond to the question. While Shelby is responding, please feel free to use any of those hashtags and engage with a response in the chat. If there's anything that comes up in the chat that we feel like is really relevant to the conversation, we'll call it out, and we will kind of use that to be a part of our conversation as well. So Shelby, my first question is, what do we mean by data culture, and what are the characteristics of a strong data culture?
Yeah, thanks for this question, Ronnie. Obviously, I knew it was coming, but I think it's an important place for us to start, mostly because at Education Elements, we haven't always really focused on our consulting practice when it comes to data. Data played a really important role in a lot of our instructional design and strategy development, but we hadn't set aside an intentional focus for supporting districts around data and data use. And so when we decided that was really important, and we were getting a lot of questions around that, we had to decide what aspect of data do we feel like people need the most help with. And my personal experience, and just having worked with districts all over the country, felt strongly that the last thing districts and schools needed was more data, right? That there's been so many investments in collecting student information, family information, collecting feedback from communities, that schools and districts have a lot of information, that it's more so how that information is used to inform their practice, to inform their decisions, that we felt like people needed more support with. And so that's where this data culture concept was born out of. It was more so focused on how do we help organizations, specifically districts and schools, get really good at using their data. And we feel like it's the culture around data that really defines that. And so the first thing we had to do was define, okay, what do we mean by data culture? And so if you'll jump to the next slide, Ronnie, I'll take you through some aspects that we defined that we feel like really closely align with what we mean by culture. And the first one of those has to do with beliefs, that every organization has their their set of things that they believe to be true about data. We're going to talk about this a little bit when we get deeper into the connection between PL and data culture, but there are things that your teachers believe to be true about data, how it's used, what it's valuable for. There are things that your students and your parents believe to be true about data, and all of that informs your culture, as does your kind of norms around how you use data, what your expectations are, the practices that are kind of deeply embedded and reinforced in your organization. We call those norms, and those also inform your culture, along with spaces. This is kind of where data are used. If you're talking about them in PLCs, for example, this is a data space that kind of defines your culture, where you store it, how it's shared. All of those, again, inform the data use in your district, or what we refer to as your culture. And then the last two things, values, we find very much drive how data are used, or the extent to which they are used. There are a lot of decisions that you make either intentionally or unintentionally around what information is important and what information isn't. That will really define your culture, in addition to resources. So this is often what people think of first. This is like the data that we have, the data we've chosen to collect, the tools that we have. This is usually what people think about when we ask them to define their data culture. They think, okay, well, we have this information, we use this dashboard, and certainly all of that informs the culture, but it's really just one part of it. And so the second part of your question you asked, Rani, is like, what makes a really strong data culture? And that's what we really had to dig into next. So if we believe, all of these components are what shapes how a district uses its information, or school uses its information, how can we define what it means to be really strong in that area? I won't dig too deep into each of these. I'll just explain what each of them are, but this is certainly something you can follow up with this if you're interested in digging into one of these a little bit deeper. But I'll start at like the 12 o'clock of this compass here in terms of alignment. And we believe that a data culture that's really strong is thinking about and making decisions about data in a really aligned way. We'll actually talk about this a little bit later, but they are selecting data resources that connect to the things that are most important to them, right? And using that to measure some of the priorities that they have set for their district. I'm looking at my like 1 o'clock now. We talk a lot about promoting equity and inclusion through data culture, which means transparency. It means empowering stakeholders with data use, feeling like everyone has a space in this data conversation. And it's not something that we collect and kind of keep in a space so that we can do for, but rather it's something that we collect and analyze and talk about with everyone so that we can do with. That is kind of closely related to this idea of a holistic data culture, which is talking about really having very diversified data sources that we use, that we're thinking about student performance, for example, in a holistic way, that we are measuring our impact using a lot of different data sources. This is the idea of branching out beyond just standardized testing data, for example, and thinking about data in a more holistic way to shape how we use it and really how we talk about data-informed conversations. Responsive is kind of similar to that, in that we want to be really flexible and responsive in terms of the needs of our organization. So a data culture that is constantly evolving and responding to the needs of the organization and its stakeholders. For example, COVID was a period where we had to be really responsive around the data that we used. There were brand new student needs and staff needs, and a really strong data culture in the responsive sense is one that can kind of pivot and say, okay, now we need this information to answer this question. And user-centered and sustainable. User-centered is just what it sounds like. Rani touched on this earlier, that we want our system and our culture to be driven by the people who really need to use the data. And an interesting insight that I had getting into this work is that I always thought of teachers as the users, right? Like those are the people that need to be able to use the data every day and make really informed instructional decisions, which is true. But I had someone challenge me on that and say, it's actually students. Students are the users here, and the teachers are just the conduits to which we get that information to our users. Completely changed how I thought about that. And then the last one, sustainable, just, it's the idea that if we are building all of these strong data culture components, we want to do so in a way that's sustainable. It's not just tied to one really strong school leader or district leader, but it's really embedded throughout our culture across our organization. I know that was a lot, but I think hopefully that kind of grounds our conversation around what we mean by data culture and how we can connect it to our strategies around personalized learning.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Shelby. That's a great segue to our next question, which is, so we have this idea of these are components of personalizing learning. These are systems level principles that kind of describe how we can shift towards a more personalized learning experience. Thinking specifically about data culture, what role does data culture play in personalized learning?
Yeah, I love this question because it made me get really intentional around the connection here. And I'll start with where people usually think first. If you remember the core 4 that Rani shared with you, one of those pieces was targeted instruction. And I think this is where people usually go first when they think about the intersection between data and personalized learning, right? It's using information to provide very targeted and personalized instruction. And so, certainly that is, I think, a very kind of probably the most obvious connection. But I think where sometimes there's a miss here is that can be interpreted as just giving teachers information, right? If we give them the data that they need to target instruction, then we've done our job as a school leader and as a district leader. But in reality, when we're doing our personalized kind of consulting work, personalized learning consulting work, we find that there is a lot of work there needed in helping them use that information. That sometimes it's just data overload and they have to figure out how to prioritize it. Sometimes it's just helping them make the space and like fold it into their practice so they're doing it in an ongoing way. But providing data is not enough for targeted instruction. There's this culture component of the habits of being able to use it, building out kind of their data practice so that they're doing it, again, in a responsive way every day and not just once or twice a year or when they meet as a PLC. So I think that's the one. But honestly, it's not just about targeted instruction. I think that whole practice around supporting teachers and their ability to use data goes beyond just targeted instruction. When we think about student reflection and goal setting, there's a lot of information there. And the reflection piece of that component of the core 4, I think, is often overlooked. We talk a lot about goal setting, but then we have to revisit that in terms of reflection and looking at information that informs, where are they in that goal? What is their progress in that? And I think that is a teacher practice that we can invest more time in, is how do they help their students? Again, thinking about their students as the end users of data. How do we help their students use information to kind of reflect on the goals that they've set for themselves, their progress towards their learning targets? So I want to kind of push the issue that it's not just about targeted instruction. Really, every element of the core 4 has a data culture component to it. And then I've got one more point, and then Rani, any reactions that you have or anything you're seeing in the chat here. But the last one I'm thinking of, if you remember when we looked at the components of data culture, beliefs and values is a really important driver in culture. And something we have found in our personalized learning work is that if you don't have a culture, a data culture, where teachers can view data beyond just an evaluative thing, then it's really hard for them to use data in a really meaningful way. And so it requires a data culture where there's this belief that data are used and valued beyond just evaluating performance. That kind of creates this psychological safety and space for teachers to see the value, to kind of release like their fear and anxiety around what the data are saying and be able to use it in a really genuine and kind of authentic way. But I think that is a very foundational need. In any school, you've got to create that psychological safety, create that culture of like using data beyond just, this is going to get me in trouble. If teachers are really going to be able to use it in an authentic way, whether it's targeting instruction, reflection and goal setting, or any component of their PL work.
Thank you so much for that, Shelby. I'm getting a couple of reactions in the chat. Thank you, Mariska, David, and Dana. Dana has a question asking if you can give an example of that.
Let's see, an example. I'm going to interpret your question here, Dana, but let me know if you're intending it in a different way. But I would say an example of ways you can create the psychological safety to think about data in a non-evaluative way is modeling for sure. One of the things we tell leaders when it comes to creating psychological safety on teams is to model vulnerability. As a leader, to pull up an example of maybe data that doesn't paint a very compelling picture, particularly of the leader, and being able to model, okay, I see the learning opportunity in this, and I'm being very open and vulnerable and showing data that, potentially I could get really defensive about or be really insecure about, but I'm going to show you that I'm using this in a way that's going to inform my practice and that I value it beyond just what it is saying about my performance here. So I think modeling is a great example of how you can start to nurture and establish that. And then of course, reinforcement. I think we just have to be really aware as leaders how we react to data and make sure that we're not creating an environment in which they get really defensive or nervous about what the data say. That if we can model seeing, and I hate to use the word failure, but let's just call it air quote failure, but modeling failure as learning opportunities, I think that starts to create more of that psychological safety as well.
Yeah, Shelby, I think in so many contexts, data is seen in such an evaluative way that it feels almost like a scary word or a dirty word. And the way to tackle that is to just really be open and vulnerable as a leader so that everybody else that you directly impact that builds that psychological safety.
I agree. Sorry, one more thing you made me think of, Rani, too. When we were talking about components of a strong data culture, I think that holistic component is something that really helps out here too, because accountability data, student achievement data, it's really hard to get buy-in from teachers and school leaders that can be used for something else, because it is very much framed around that's the purpose and that's how it's mostly used. So if you just can't get past that, I think branching out and thinking about what other kinds of data that don't have that same sort of evaluative stigma attached to them can we use to guide these conversations might be a good starting point.
Absolutely. And Kim says in the chat, build the same safety with students as well, so that when students are analyzing their data, not only are you modeling that with your teachers as a school leader, but then you are building that safety in teachers that they can turn that skill around with their students so that students feel comfortable with their own data as well.
Absolutely. Yes. I love that, Kim.
A couple of questions. I just wanted to shout out a couple of comments. David at Park Center High, on fire, that you model vulnerability. Give yourself a pat on the back for that. And then there was that, David, you also made the comment about data in your building is very general and not student specific as one of the challenges that you face. Shelby, do you have any kind of initial responses to that? Like, data is very general, it's not very student specific. What is one way that we can shift in the right direction?
Sorry, I was reading ahead to Karen's question, which is a really good one, but do you mind telling me that question one more time? And I'd be happy to address it.
Oh yeah, the challenge here is that data in general in my building is very general. It is not student specific.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I do think data, the power of data is that it can inform, and when we're talking about specifically in the concept of personalized learning, it has to be specific in terms of being able to guide specific instructional actions or personalized learning decisions. So I'm going to answer this in two ways. I'm going to say, one, I think that is probably a call to action to think, how do we get more specific data for our teachers, that there's a need here. But in the interim, data is expensive. And so as you're figuring that out and realizing, okay, we've got like a pretty generalized data set here? How do we get more specific? I think there's probably a reflection component to it, because one thing we know for sure about teachers is that they intuitively know a lot about their kids. They don't always need like student performance data to be able to tell you this kid is struggling with this kid is struggling with this. They, in a lot of ways, can, they know this intuitively because they spend every day with these kids. And so if you're looking at a general data set and they're seeing some trends in the data and may not be specific to the kids in your class, I think there's a reflection there. What trends do you see here may also be true for your students, even if this information isn't specific to your kids. Getting them to make those connections, but then also pushing them to kind of challenge their bias, because I think too, there's a lot of assumptions and bias or bias-informed assumptions that are made that they can, I think, anticipate like, this is what I think might be true for my kids, but push them to test that. Like, how will you find out if that is true? One example I'll give, I'm talking in the abstract here, but maybe you have a like high level district level data set that is showing that kids are really struggling with reading development between the grades 4 and 5. Right? And you're sharing this with your 5th grade teachers and saying, do you think this is true with your 5th grade readers? And if so, how can you test this? What are some things you might want to ask them, things you might want to look at to see if these specific trends are true for your kids? And then if so, what are the implications of that? I hope that is helpful, but I think anytime you can get them to like reflect on what they're seeing elsewhere and connect it to their classroom, you can make up for the fact that you don't have that specific data about those kids.
Thank you so much for that, Shelby. Lots of thoughts in the chat. I think one more question or a thought that came up in the chat from Mariska was this idea of getting teachers on board with the essential components, or maybe even just the essential component of data culture, getting them to learn about it without feeling like they're doing something new because they're already feeling like they're stretched to the max.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this is something we're thinking about in all components of our work, whether we are, trying to help teachers build more personalized instruction practices, whether we're helping them use data in different ways. I mean, the reality that we're in is that they're just being asked to do so many different things, and they are also still processing and coming out of a really like personally traumatic year. And so everything feels heavy right now. And so the guidance we're giving leaders is anytime you can message something as this is a way to do something you're already doing rather than something different to do, it helps them. And so, and I would also, like, if I was talking to a teacher right now and they were saying like, I'm already doing too many things, I can't also do this. My response to that would be, tell me the things that you're doing today and tell me the things that you are maybe spending the most of your time on. Being able to identify one of those things and say, okay, you are already, I'm trying to think of a good example here, but you're already collecting data from your kids around like their goals. You're having them set goals every day. So how can we now fold in, gosh, I'm struggling to think of a really good example on the fly, but it's pointing out what they're already doing and essentially saying, okay, let's just do this in a more holistic way. Maybe let's give them some options now. Maybe they can pull from 4 different areas of the day to set their goal instead of making them set it in this specific concept. So I fumbled through that, but I would say it's just that idea of helping them identify that this is a way of doing what they're already doing and not just something completely in addition to.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Shelby. And I think there's a follow-up question from Dana that I've never heard expressed in this way, but I think it's a really interestingly phrased question. And I'm curious what your thoughts on that is. The question is the idea of you're expecting this might expect teachers to act as data analysts. And the question is, can you comment on how widespread you've seen this practice?
Yeah, I love this question because I think this is a really important way for us to think about it and how we frame it when we talk to teachers. One of our guiding beliefs around data is that we are all data analysts. Every day we use data to make decisions. This morning when I woke up, I got dressed today based on what the weather was outside. Not very well informed because I'm in Central Texas and I'm in a sweater, but I used information to make that decision. And teachers are doing that every day. They are looking at information to guide what decisions that they make. It's about it's about coaching the way in which they use information, helping them use the information that's going to help them make the best decisions, helping them use that information in a way that kind of removes their bias or brings in more intention around personalized learning. And so, yes, there are people in districts and in the world that are like highly trained data analysts and do it in a much like deeper, more complex and scientific way. And that's not what we're asking teachers to do. It's more so getting more intentional and more informed about the ways that they are already making data informed decisions every day. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Those are pretty much all of the questions that we've had in the chat so far.
Okay.
I encourage everybody to continue to use the chat, continue to use the hashtags. Thank you for humoring us with that. Shelby, thinking about some of these challenges that you've already addressed, that were already expressed in the chat, are there any other ways that you've seen districts be challenged in relation to developing a strong data culture?
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges that I find myself talking a lot about these days, mostly at the district level, but I think there are some like school level implications here, is in using data to kind of monitor their success with something or evaluate like how well a program is going or how well like our personalized learning initiative is going, sticking, with that connection here. And the challenge with that is almost always we want to jump to outcomes. We want to jump to impact, right? And usually that means student outcomes and impact. And so we're looking at, okay, I did this one thing. Are their reading scores improving? And that is an impact metric. And we know just intuitively that often that takes a long time to show up in data. And so there's this like in between time when we're wondering and doubting and thinking, does this really matter? Am I making an impact here? Am I doing this the right way or should I be doing something different? And so framing that we have found really helpful is on the next slide, Rani, right? Around thinking about these metrics in kind of three buckets. The first one is fidelity. So the extent to which we're like essentially doing what we said we were going to do. So if I, as a teacher, am really focused on my personalized learning tactics, moves, decisions here. And one of the areas of the core 4 that I am focused on is targeted instruction. A fidelity metric there might be how many days a week are kids learning in small groups that are informed by data. It's a fidelity metric. Like, am I doing it? Am I putting this practice into place? I think that has to be measured first, because oftentimes if the answer is no there, it does, impact is something you can't even imagine to measure. And so if I am a teacher and wondering about my own progress here, or if a school leader is wondering how this initiative is going, or if a district is wanting to measure, something that they've invested a lot in, I think you have to start with fidelity and first see if the things that you're trying to put in place are actually happening. And if they're not, you have to answer why first. Is it that they need more development and training and support? They need more systems around them. There's a block there in terms of like, there's some sort of barrier that we have to remove if they're actually going to be able to do this. It's only after you see things happening with fidelity can you then look at effectiveness. And this is around like, are you starting to see changes? Are the changes you're starting to see in the classroom, are they producing some desired effects? Oftentimes when we have a continuum around this core 4, which we should link to this video if you come back in YouTube, but a lot of those look-fors in the continuum are around what you see in the classroom, right? They're not impact-based. We're not yet looking at student data, but we're looking at what's happening in the classroom. For example, in the area of goal setting and reflection, can students tell you, I'm at this point towards my goal, this is my progress towards this goal that I set for myself. If they can, then you're seeing some desired effects here that we're behind deciding to focus on that area to begin with. And then only after that can you start looking at impact. And of course, again, for students, a lot of times this is what we see in like student data and outcomes. And so the idea is if they have more ownership and advocacy over their work, are we seeing impact in terms of higher levels of student engagement, higher performance in specific areas where they get to live out these areas of personalized learning. So a quick summary around this, if you'll flip it to the next one, Rani. Quick way to think about this is fidelity. Are we doing what we said we were going to do? Effectiveness is around like, are we seeing changes in staff in terms of what their actions are? And then are we seeing changes in students as a result of what we did? So that's one of the challenges. Again, I think it's often like school and district level implications here, but it's also a way for teachers to, I think, kind of evaluate their own practice too.
Yeah, thank you for that, Shelby. As we close out this conversation, we encourage everybody in attendance to continue to use the chat. If there are any last minute questions that you want answered with me and Shelby on the call, definitely feel free to put those in the chat right now. But as we close out, we're curious to hear from you all in the chat. What's giving you hope right now? What are you inspired to try? What have you been trying that you want to enhance? You want to kind of keep the process going as it relates to the data culture in your context and or personalized learning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that question in the chat and play a song, and would love for you all to take a moment to reflect on that question. What are you inspired to try, and what's giving you hope right now as it relates to data culture and personalized learning?
Hey, Rani, Mariska actually asked a really good question. Do you mind if I talk through that while people reflect instead of
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love this question. We get a lot of questions, particularly around the holistic component of the framework I shared earlier. What other kinds of metrics should we be considering other than just test scores and grades? We can't overemphasize the power of student feedback. I think this is something that it takes a strong leader and teacher, and I think, typically those that are very focused on personalized learning and kind of think about instruction in that way, value student feedback. But this is something we've just seen so much power in, and so many informed decisions. If you value what students are saying, sometimes we'll get pushback there saying like, we can't get quality feedback from students, or, they give us feedback that's not informed. And I think you're always going to have, circumstances around that, but by and large, asking students about, how things are going, what the impact of those changes have been, is really powerful. And it can be done in informal ways. We talk a lot about exit tickets, getting feedback from students, and it can be done in very formal ways. I think that student surveying is hugely valuable, even though it's perception-based. Their perception matters a lot in terms of how much impact it's going to have on their performance. So we're also a big believer in surveying and perception data. That can really help inform like the change that you're hoping to see, and certainly fidelity metrics in terms of, are the instructional practices that you're trying to embed in classrooms, are people at least perceiving that those are happening, or they're seeing examples of that? I think the other area of data that I've seen a lot of growth in that is really interesting is around student engagement data, that it's not just about perception anymore. I think the only way we knew how to evaluate that or collect student engagement data was through surveying. Still think that is informative and powerful, but there's just a lot of unique ways that people are collecting that now, which is like interaction time. Like there's a lot of interesting tech platforms out there, particularly since we just got out of a big, heavy virtual learning period, that are thinking about metrics of engagement in different ways. So I think that's still a pretty big area of growth and innovation, but I definitely see a lot of potential there. I hope that helps. I think it was Mariska that asked that question. And then this is also a really good one around coping with parents who want to see quick results. Honestly, that's a question I haven't gotten, at least not lately. I think it's a really good one though. One of the things we talk about in terms of a data culture that promotes equity and inclusion is bringing parents into the data conversation. That again, it's not, we want to kind of move away from the world where we like give parents data and say, this is what it means, and rather engage them in a conversation where they can access their kids' data on their own, that they can kind of, if they have a question about their students' performance, there's a way that they can dig through a bunch of information to answer that. And that the conversations with teachers and school leaders are more conversations about the implications and what we as a team can do to partner around like results that we want to see. Also love it when those are student-led, right? When we see the students being the users and owner of that data and guiding those conversations. So in terms of parents wanting to see quick results, I think framing data conversations in that way, sometimes it can be reframed as, well, we know that like student outcomes take a while, but what are some things in the interim that would be really powerful for you to see? I'll give you a quick example. My son is in speech therapy. He has a stutter, and so he is in speech class at school. And when we put him in that class, we wanted to see that he didn't stutter anymore, and that his occurrences of that and his amount of frustration with it would immediately decline. And I'm learning a lot about speech therapy and know that that's not the goal here. But something I learned in data conversations with the speech therapist is that a really powerful progression is that he can identify when he's struggling with it, and he can talk about it and explain what it is to other people. And we've seen a lot of change in him. So again, just setting those conversations with parents in a way that it's like, this is an outcome that we may not be able to see immediately, but let's together identify some things that would be really powerful, and even better if students can identify those things for themselves.
Thank you for that example, Shelby. There's another question in the chat from him about how would you measure engagement? Earlier, you were talking about student engagement. What are some examples of measuring that?
Yeah, I'm getting over my skis here a little bit because this is not my particular area of expertise, but I know there's some really powerful thought leadership happening in this, again, because I think the disruption of 2020 and 2021 and the very immediate shift to virtual learning made us have to think about student engagement in a different way. And so I think there's been some really innovative thinking around how do we define engagement beyond just a student saying, yes, I'm engaged in this class in a survey. And to be completely honest, I don't have a thoughtful response to that. But I do think that this is an emerging area, and we're going to see a lot of really interesting metrics that people are recommending based on research that they're doing. And one thing I'll take away from this conversation is I'd love for us to have kind of a bank of resources that we can share. And if so, I will commit to putting them in the description of this video when we post it on YouTube. So check back, I'll look into that a little deeper.
Absolutely, thank you so much for pointing that out. And then the last thing that I saw in the chat, Alicia, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Actually a question from Poland, not from the US. So hello to Poland. Parents and even headmasters will always ask for proof in the form of better grades or exam results, and personalizing is really tough in that context.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to say, like, I don't think that we are absent of this challenge in the US either. That standardized testing and school accountability is still a very significant driver of school and classroom action. So we are certainly still struggling with this. I think there's a call to action to move beyond it, but I don't know that we've yet completely figured that out. And so, in some of the really meaningful conversations and workshops that I've been in around this, I think it's been around the so what. So when parents or headmasters say, I want to see these exam results, one of the really powerful questions I've heard as a follow-up is, what will that tell you? So if you see those exam results here, what will you believe to be true? Does that make you feel like this student is going to have a better chance of success in college? Does that exam score make you feel like that they are going to get a better job? Or does that exam score just make you feel better about the rating that our school is going to get? It sounds like harsh and direct, but I think having those really candid conversations can sometimes piece apart the why behind what they're looking for. They may say, yes, I believe that exam score is going to mean that the student's going to get a better job. But a lot of times it can still be a yes and. Well, what else, though, are we going to need to see in order to feel like this student is really set up for success in the next school level or in their next step after high school? And sometimes that can open up a conversation to other things. It doesn't have to be a yes, but it can and should be a yes, and we want to see these other things. So I don't think we're ever going to win the argument that we should completely move away from exam scores and standardized testing. The conversation we want to have is what else can we add to that to feel like we're getting a really comprehensive view of student needs and their potential for success after high school.
And that really speaks to that holistic component of data culture.
For sure, yeah.
Well, we hope that you all found this time valuable. Thank you so much for your engagement, for all of your questions. Feel free to reach back out to us if you have any lingering thoughts. Like Shelby and I mentioned, we will also be posting this video to YouTube. I linked earlier in the chat a link to kind of the home base of data culture on our website, from which you can access all of our published content around data culture. There were a couple of requests around, are there any blog posts or things like that that we can put in front of teachers that we can start to have these conversations? So I'm going to link those in the chat again. Before you all get on with your day, one thing that we would love from you is to spend just a couple of moments filling out our closing survey. We love hearing from you about how these webinars are going. I'm going to link the closing survey in the chat, and would love for you all to just spend a couple of minutes taking the survey and letting us know how we can make the webinars better and more valuable. So here's the link to the closing survey. It's in the chat. And in addition, I'm also going to relink what I shared earlier, which is a link to our website that you can use as a jumping off point to access all of the published content around data culture that you can start sharing with the people that you impact, your teachers, your school leaders, etc. Anything else to add, Shelby, as we close out?
No, just super grateful for all the engagement in the chat. These were amazing questions. I'm walking away with so much to think about and research. And thanks to you, Rani, for leading a great conversation today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Shelby. Thank you so much, everybody. We look forward to hearing back from you soon, to seeing your feedback on the closing survey. And I hope you have a fantastic Friday.